So today we're going to go over a few ideas and some hints for keeping the water out of your equipment. Historically, the ocean has always won. Our goal here is to prevent water from entering our housings, eliminate corrosion where we can, and ensure that our strobes always fire. So we have some good news and some bad news. The good news is that the majority of floods are operator error. That means that most floods are preventable. The bad news here is that if water does get into your housing, the likelihood is that it's your fault. You will want to assemble your equipment in a clean, dry environment. If you have an issue with condensation forming inside of your housing, try putting your setup together in an air-conditioned room and even including a packet of silica gel inside the housing. When you're putting your equipment together, you want to focus on what you're doing and avoid any interruptions. These generally lead to mistakes. The last place I want to open up a camera housing is on an open boat. I try to avoid doing this at all costs. Before I put the camera into the housing, I double check the battery, make sure I have a fresh one, and I look at all the images on the card and make sure that those can be erased and I can get rid of them. So I format the card. In the past, I have halfway through a dive filled the card and not been able to shoot for the last half of the dive, only to find when I get back to my computer that I forgot to format the card initially and half the card was filled with old images that I could have deleted. When I travel, I wrap my housing and my ports in a plastic bag and then I seal that with packing tape. So I tape that all up and then I'll put bubble wrap around the ports, or I'll use my clothing to cushion everything in my case. Some people feel that once it's all packed up, if you cannot drop it from 10 feet and have it land on concrete and be okay, then you have to rethink your packaging. You cannot get to all the O-rings on your housings, but the ones that you can get to, you want to monitor closely and service them if need be. Some of the O-rings, such as this port O-ring, is contained in a slot, and you can usually get to it by pinching either side of the O-ring and bowing it out and then using your other finger to lift it out of that slot. If I can't get an O-ring out with just my fingers, I move on to this plastic gizmo that's made for flossing, and it has various points that you can sneak under an O-ring and pry it out. CNC even makes a plastic O-ring remover, but in a pinch, a credit card will do the trick with a round corner. Always try and avoid using something metallic and sharp that might damage the O-ring, or even worse, scratch the sealing surface of the housing itself. After you get the O-ring off, you want to have a look at the sealing surface where that O-ring sits, and you want to clean out any sand or grit. This is especially important after a dive where you've been in a really silty environment. So pick the housing up, twirl it around, make sure you look at every inch of that sealing surface and make sure there's not something there. Now take a close look at the O-ring itself. Make sure it's free and clear of any grains of sand or hairs. Get everything off of that. As far as grease goes, a little bit goes a long ways. So you want to run the O-ring through your fingers to make sure every little bit of it gets greased. But you don't want to stretch the O-ring when you do this. If you pull on it too hard, that stretch can become permanent and it'll be loose in the position where it needs to be on the housing. The O-ring for the back of the housing and the O-ring for the port has two surfaces that it seals up against. So you want to check both of these, where the O-ring sits and also where the O-ring squishes up against when it seals. Both of these surfaces need to be clean and free of debris. At the same time, check the inside of the glass itself and make sure that it's clear and clean. Before you put the camera into your housing, check your settings so that your ISO, shutter speed, and aperture are close to what you will want when you jump in the water. Always format your card in the camera. Do not erase your image files with a computer. Be sure your battery is fully charged. With some cameras, you can check the condition of the battery in the menu of the camera itself. Some cameras have a plate that mounts to the camera, and then the camera as a unit slides into the housing. Other cameras mount directly onto the housing. Whichever yours is, you want to make sure that the camera is very firm inside that housing. If it's loose at all, some of the controls may not line up or operate properly. And last but not least, you want to take that lens cap off your camera before you slide it into the housing. I can't count the number of times someone who's been rushed has ended up underwater with a lens cap on and unable, obviously, to take pictures. There are several connections between your camera and your strobes. The first one is the hot shoe that slides onto your camera, so make sure this is on correctly and snug up against the front. The screen on the back of your camera is where you will be reviewing your images underwater, so make sure that is clean on the back of the camera, and also the inside of the back of the housing, make sure that's clear so that you get a good look at those images. And speaking of being rushed, do not be that person who rushes to put their camera together to make a dive. It is one of the common denominators in flooded cameras. And if you encounter someone who has flooded a camera, you want to give them lots of space to work through the problems that are ahead of them. So clean the area where the O-ring is going to sit. A little bit of grease on the O-ring if it needs it. Carefully put it back in place on the back of the housing. So you want to snap opposite clamps simultaneously as you put the back onto the housing. Many housing manufacturers have incorporated a vacuum pump into their equipment. This attaches to the housing through a special port. The pump pulls the air from the housing, creating a vacuum inside. In the case of this Ike-Light accessory, I pump the vacuum up to 10 inches of mercury on the gauge that's attached to the pump. I then detach the pump and replace the plug with the O-rings. This is very important. Water will enter the housing without that plug in place. The strobes are next, the same as your housing. You want to check the sealing surfaces for the O-ring, both sides of it. Pull the O-ring off and clean in the groove where that O-ring sits. A little bit of grease goes a long way, so just put a small dab on your finger and then run that O-ring through your fingers so that you coat all parts of it. Then take the O-ring and sort of roll it back and forth in your fingers just so you can see all sides of it and make sure there's no lint or anything stuck to it. Snap the strobe back together, and now we have to get the cords. There will be a cap or a cover where the strobe cord plugs into the strobe, so you first need to remove that. The cord will also have some sort of a cap protecting that connection. So remove the cap and then get a good look at that O-ring. If it looks dry at all, you should be able to remove it by again pinching two sides of it and then popping it off over the end of the connector. It's a small O-ring, so it doesn't take much grease. So a little dab on your fingers, run it through, and once it's greased up, you can put it back on. Make sure you line up the cord connections and then tighten the screw down firmly, not too tight. You don't need to crank really hard on it to make a seal. If you're using two strobes, grab that second strobe and repeat. And so the final connection is on the housing itself. That too should have some sort of a cap protecting the threads. So remove that cap and then go ahead and again check the O-ring on the cord itself that's going to seal and make sure that it's clean, and if you need to grease it, put a little dab on. Make that final connection with the cord into the housing, and now it's time to test the whole unit out and make sure that everything is working. So turn the camera on, put your eye up to the viewfinder, and make sure that the autofocus is functioning properly. You can put your hand in front of the housing, focus on that, and then take your hand away and make sure that it focuses further away. There's a button on most lenses to turn the autofocus off and on. And if that button protrudes a little bit, as you put it into the housing, sometimes you will knock it from autofocus back to manual focus and it won't work. Turn the strobes on, put your finger on the trigger, and fire a couple test shots to make sure that the strobes are indeed firing along with the camera. If everything is working as it should be, make sure you turn the camera off and the strobes off to save those batteries for when you're underwater. I usually try to put my cameras together the night before, and so the next morning I undo the vacuum plug and then I plug the pump back in and just check the gauge and make sure that it's still at that 10 mark. And then I know no air has entered the housing, so no water is going to enter the housing. And then you always remember to put that plug immediately back in so you don't have any issues with water coming into your housing. Now, if you don't have a vacuum port on your housing, the other route is to take it and put it underwater anywhere you can. The rinse tank is perfect. And fire your strobes a few times while it's in the rinse tank to double check and make sure everything is functioning properly. And then pull it back out and have a look at it for leaks and cross your fingers. On the boat, or really anywhere, it's best to put your camera on the deck or on the floor, somewhere where it cannot fall. So up on the seat, especially on a rocking boat, is not a great idea. When you enter the water, you want to do so without your camera and have someone pass it into the water straight to you nice and gently. The surface is where most problems occur, so check your housing as soon as you get it in the water and have a look and make sure everything's okay. It is the combination of all these little things that will avoid you experiencing an underwater photographer's worst day.
You're going to get a new camera, a new lens, and a new housing.
It was us that screwed up. You did everything right.
Of course, we will replace everything.
This never happens. We'll fix everything and throw in a unicorn.
You got any spare lube?
Okay.
Okay, you better start over. Yeah.
One more time here. Okay, we're rolling.